Hello and welcome to our first video for Unit 1, Biological Basis of Behavior. In this unit, we will be talking about the following topics: heredity versus environment, the nervous system, the endocrine system, the brain, psychoactive drugs, sleep and dreaming, and sensation. This is a fairly big unit, and so we're going to dive right in with our introduction to biological psychology. At the end of this video, you will be able to answer the following questions. What is biological psychology? What is the relationship between heredity and environment in shaping behavior and mental processes? And how are biological psychology and the brain studied? We are going to start this video by talking about what biological psychology is. So, biological psychology is really focusing on the physical aspects of our body and our brain. This includes the structures of our brain, the nervous and endocrine systems, our genes, and heredity. So, how our genes are passed to us from our parents, as well as how genes are passed throughout a species. Because we're talking about how genes are passed throughout a species, we also need to talk about what evolutionary psychology is. And this is really focusing on the idea of natural selection and the survival of the fittest. So, evolutionary psychologists believe that our behavior can be traced back to what is best for our species and how we will continue to pass along the best traits to our children and their children. Unfortunately, this perspective did lead to an awful movement in history, and that was the eugenics movement. There were some evolutionary psychologists that believed that they could use this to study how traits are passed from one generation to the next. They wanted to find a way to keep desirable traits passing along from generation to generation and wiping out the undesirable traits. Unfortunately, this led to discrimination against people of different races, as well as people with different mental and physical disabilities. One of the key debates in psychology today is this question of nature versus nurture. What is going to be the reason for someone's behavior? Is it because of their biology? So their genes, their DNA, their structures of their brain, that would be nature. Or is it because of the environment that they are in or they are raised in? That's nurture. And psychologists continue to struggle with this idea of nature versus nurture and which one is the real reason. In general, most psychologists believe that it is both nature and nurture that are going to be playing a role. And this is where the study of behavior genetics comes in. And this is the study of genetic and environmental influences on behavior. Specifically, epigenetics is the study of how the environment and other factors can change the way that genes are expressed. So the idea here is that we all have genes. I like to think of them as little light switches inside of our body. We're all born with these light switches, but the environment is the thing that comes in and turns on those light switches. So epigenetics is that study of how is the environment playing a role in turning on or flipping on those genes that we were already born with. Heritability is the likelihood that people's differences in that trait are due to genes. So epigenetics is looking at how the environment plays a role in how our genes are expressed. Heritability is giving us a mathematical number that is going to tell us how likely are those differences from one person to another due to genes. And we are going to look at a slide in just a second that's going to explain this a little bit further. In general, biological psychologists, as well as most other psychologists, are going to look through the biopsychosocial approach. This is the idea that, yes, while we agree genes, DNA, our brain structures, our biology play a role in our behavior, we cannot simply look at our biology. We must look at the holistic picture. What else is influencing our behavior and our mental processes? So let's go back to heritability. Heritability, again, is the likelihood that the differences in traits are due to genes. So heritability is measured on a scale of 0 to 1. 0 means that the difference in this trait from one person to another is not at all due to genes. And a high heritability, or a heritability score closer to 1, is going to mean that the differences between one person and the next are absolutely due to genes. So our example is, let's just say we have 4 boys, and this isn't ethical, it's hypothetical, but we are going to raise all 4 of those boys who are genetically dissimilar, so they are not related, in the exact same environment. Let's say we're going to raise them in a barrel. We're going to put all 4 of them into a barrel. You can see it on this screen. If we take them out after 15 years and we see that all 4 of them are different heights, we can determine that the difference in their heights, right, the trait being their height, is because of their genes. Because all 4 boys were raised in the exact same environment, it can't be the environment that made them tall or short. It has to be their genes. That would mean that we have a very high heritability for that trait. Let's look at the opposite scenario. If we take 4 genetically identical boys and we raise them in 4 completely different environments, you can see on this picture down at the bottom, we have 1 raised in North America, 1 in South America, 1 in Australia, and then 1 on the moon. And we measure them at 15 years old, and all 4 of them are completely different heights. We can determine the difference in height must be due to their environment. Because their genes are exactly the same, their height cannot be controlled by their genes. It must be controlled by the environment. Now, obviously, these are unethical situations. We wouldn't do this. This is just to kind of grasp this idea of heritability and what it means. So how do we study biological psychology? If we can't put people into barrels or put them all over the world, how do we study biological psychology? Major way that we do study biological psychology in this question of nature versus nurture is we look at twin studies. So before we get into what twin studies are, let's talk about the different types of twins that we have. Identical twins or monozygotic twins were formed from 1 fertilized egg that split into 2. Identical twins have the exact same DNA. They are genetic clones of each other. So you would never be able to have male-female identical twins. Identical twins will always be the same biological sex because they have the exact same DNA. Fraternal twins, on the other hand, are dizygotic twins, meaning they are 2 fertilized eggs that develop separately. Fraternal twins are no more genetically similar than any other siblings. So twin studies are going to use identical and fraternal twins to gather more information about this idea of environment and nature and how they play a role in development. Specifically, identical twins are used when we want to control for nature. If we have 2 identical people, then we know that it can't be the genes that are playing a role in the development or in that behavior. It must be the environment. One such example of a twin study is Kendler et al. And Kendler was trying to find if major depressive disorder was inherited. So what they did is they took over 15,000 twin pairs and they had telephone interviews with them. They asked these twins questions about their symptoms of major depression. They asked whether they grew up in the same environment. They really just gathered a bunch of information about these twins. And what they found is that around 8,000 sets of twins suffered from major depressive disorder at some point in their life. They also found there was a higher concordance rate with identical twins than fraternal twins. What does this tell us? This means that because more identical twins both shared major depression, it must be somewhat due to genes. Does it mean that depression is completely inherited? No, of course not. However, because there's higher rate of major depressive disorder in identical twins than fraternal twins, we can make an assumption that there must be some genetic factor. This is just an example of how twin studies might be used to determine if a trait or a behavior is inherited. The last thing we're going to talk about for this video is how the brain is studied. We have talked about how behavior is studied through the biological lens, but now we need to look at the structures of the brain and the nervous system. So there are a few different ways for us to study the brain. The very first is psychosurgery. And this means that we can actually go into someone's head, we can look at their brain, we can look at the different structures and the sizes. We can also destroy part of the brain to see then what impact that might have. That's called brain lesioning. But obviously, this is very invasive. So there's other ways for us to go about studying the brain without actually going into someone's brain. The first is through case studies. Remember, a case study is when we're looking at a very special person or small group of people to determine what that person is experiencing. One great example of this is the case of HM. HM had a small portion of his brain removed due to a seizure disorder. After the surgery, Milner then followed up and studied HM to determine what the consequences of that surgery were on HM's behavior and mental processes. So case studies of people who have brain damage, who are going through different surgeries, can give us an insight into how one particular structure of the brain might be connected to another structure. We're going to talk more in depth about this when we're looking at some of these case studies in class. The next and most obvious way that we study the brain is through brain scans, and it is important for you to know the difference between all of these types of brain scans. The first thing we're going to talk about is the EEG, or the electroencephalogram. You can see the image on this slide is where a doctor is going to put probes all over the person's head, and they're going to measure the brain waves all over that person's head. And it actually emits a reading where you can see all of the different brain waves that are actually happening. The idea is when there are more brain waves, that part of the brain is more active. When there are less brain waves, it is less active. This gives us some insight into what part of the brain is being used in different activities. So sometimes people will read or they'll do memory tests while they have this EEG on their head. A CT scan, or computed tomography scan, is going to give us an X-ray of our brain. And it just gives us a very static X-ray image of our brain. A CT scan is not going to give us any information about which part of the brain is functioning at the time, but it can give us information about what structures are different sizes or misformed, or if there are any foreign bodies inside of the brain. The next scan we're going to talk about is another static image, which is an MRI, a magnetic resonance image. An MRI is going to use magnetic waves in order to give us a 2D static picture of our brain. An MRI gives us a little bit more detail than X-rays, and it gives us some more of those structures of the brain. It's not going to give us any information about the functioning of those structures. It's just going to show us what does our brain look like. The last two we're going to talk about are going to give us that information about function. So the PET scan, or the positron emission tomography, is going to give us information about which parts of the brain are active during a particular behavior. You can see this scan down here. The different colors do mean different things. The warmer the color, something like red, orange, or yellow, is going to mean that that part of the brain is more active during a particular behavior. The cooler colors, like blues and greens, are going to tell us that that part of the brain is a little bit less active. With PET scans, people are injected with a radioactive glucose that is going to go to the different parts of the brain when the brain is active. fMRIs are going to be similar to PET scans because they do show us which parts of the brain are active during particular behaviors or mental processes using the colors. However, they're not going to use the radioactive glucose. fMRIs are still using the magnet in order to give us that function information.